Welcome back to our 12th class on the book of Revelation. Remember in the last class, we are witnessing the seven seals being broken open. And we had the breaking of the seals, the sixth and the fifth seal, and we saw the 144,000. We also met the multitude that came out of the Great Tribulation. And we've been working up to this moment to come to the seventh seal. I mean, it all started back in Revelation 4 and chapter 5. In chapter 5, we saw the scroll that had seven seals, and we're thinking of those wax seals. And each one of these seals are being broken open. And so we're seeing that the Lamb is worthy to break the seals, and with each seal, we're getting a revelation of God's plan. So today we get the opening of the seventh seal. So we've been waiting on this. And so maybe we're expecting in this seventh seal something awesome. Maybe thunderbolts. Maybe a mushroom cloud from a nuclear explosion. Maybe the earth being obliterated. But we're going to be shocked what we find when the seventh seal is open. So let's go in and look at this seventh seal and what we witness. Revelation 8, verse 1. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Now, that is not what we were expecting, is it? I mean, we were expecting, after the build up here, something fantastic in verse 1. And so maybe it's a little bit of a letdown. There's silence, but what is this all about? This silence in heaven. So shockingly, no explosions, no peals of thunder, no judgment, just eerie silence. And to understand this eerie silence, we need to go back and realize that this book is a liturgical book. Revelation is about worship, worship of God's people, worship in the temple in heaven. Remember, the temple on earth in Jerusalem was a copy of what was in heaven. So in heaven, we get this reality, and on earth, we have a mere copy. And this 30 minutes of silence or half hour of silence would be the time when incense is offered on the altar. So this would represent the time when the priest would go into the temple and offer up incense before the Holy of Holies. So here's this glimpse into the heavenly realm. Now let's look at Revelation 8, 2 through 5. So we've already figured out that silence was probably a liturgical silence, a pause in which the altar of incense would be working and incense would be offered up before the Lord. Now let's turn to verse 2. Then I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense and the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now here's an artist's rendition of maybe how this altar looks in heaven. We don't really know, but this is someone's imagination. And the censer was something you would swing about. And so incense would be burning in this censer, and you would walk about the holy place of the temple, and you would sense all these different parts of the temple. In a minute, we're going to see what incense actually represents. There's actually churches that still do this today. If you go to a high church, Roman Catholic service, you will find incense in those churches. If you go to an Anglican or Eastern, especially Eastern Orthodox, you're going to see incense. I have to tell a funny story. One time I took my family to a Lessons in Carol service. It was basically a Christmas pageant with singing, and not really Christmas pageant, but singing of all the stories from the Christmas parts of Scripture, along with carols, old English carols. And so Lessons in Carols is an old Anglican service. It's beautiful. And we went to Swanee, University of the South, to see this great version of it. And we get in there in this huge cathedral-like building, and this girl is literally swinging this censer over her head, censing the entire place, and there's incense everywhere. And of course my children start coughing and hacking, and you could tell who did not belong in that service, who'd never been in a service like that. But later my daughter called her an Anglican ninja because she was swinging that censer over her head. But I actually have seen this in practice, someone censing an area, and some churches still do this today. So we have this censer and altar up in heaven. Now let's think about what Revelation 8, 2 through 5 may be telling us. There's these seven angels before the throne of God. Now I'm just going to give you some information. This is Take it or leave it if you want it. But in ancient Jewish tradition, this idea of the seven angels, they were known to be seven archangels that stood before God's throne. So they were some type of ruling angels. Maybe John's borrowing from that tradition. We don't know for sure if John is borrowing from that tradition or not. It's quite a possibility he is. But we know in Tobit chapter 2, verse 15 and 1 Enoch 22 through 8, we get this idea of these seven angels in particular. In 1 Enoch, it actually names the angels, these seven archangels. Once again, it's not inspired. This is just part of Jewish tradition. So we have Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Serachiel, I can never say that word, Gabriel, and Remiel. And only Michael and Gabriel are the ones mentioned in sacred scripture, inspired scripture. So we only have two inspired names that we know for sure. We know in Jewish tradition they were named. Now here's what's important for us right now. The incense offered symbolizes the prayer of the saints. We know this, Revelation 5:8 connects the prayers of the saints with incense. And it's also interesting to notice the angels carry the prayers before God. Now I don't know if that's regulative, like that always happens, like in heaven, that's how things work, that the angels carry our prayers up before God. We don't really know that for sure. We know, like in Luke 16, when Lazarus passes away, it's the angels that carry his soul to the bosom, his spirit to the bosom of Abraham. So maybe that's a role that angels play. I'm just not real sure, but I know right there it does say that. And this throwing this censer down to the earth is an image of destruction and judgment. You've got fire, lightning, thunder, and fire, of course, would make us think of fire coming from heaven, Sodom and Gomorrah. What's really interesting is in this book, Jerusalem is connected with Sodom in Revelation 11:8. That image is connected to Sodom. If this date for this book is early, like some think, like I even think this, that the book could have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem, this would fit nicely with Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD. The last time we saw the prayers of the saints, we saw it in Romans 6, where they're praying, "How long, Lord, will it be before you set things right?" So these prayers could be bringing about God's judgment. Now that's important to think about for just a minute, that the worship of God's people brings about changes upon the earth. We so many times think of evangelism, which is really important, as the main task of the church. We see discipleship as the main task of the church, and I get that. And we see worship as just like a means to those two ends. Do you get what I'm saying? We say worship helps us evangelize. These seeker-friendly churches, that's all they're about, is the worship somehow draws in people. And then there are other churches that worship is just for teaching and discipleship. A robust biblical viewpoint, and this is where you got to really baptize your imagination in Scripture and quit thinking too Western materialistic. Worship also brings about changes in the spiritual realm. It's how we wage war. I really don't think most Christians take worship serious, what's going on. Like I said, worship becomes a way for outreach or discipleship, and that is just a really, really truncated and sad way to look at worship. And it's really, I think part of it may be because we haven't read the book of Revelation enough and really understood it to get how important worship really is. And we've kind of cut ourselves off from the Old Testament too, and that's really been bad in so many ways. We have some really bad theology out there that needs to be corrected. That the worship, assembled worship of God's people, in and of itself is important. It doesn't matter if that worship is outreach oriented or is going to somehow just be about discipleship. All those are great things that happen, and that we don't have a problem with that. But the primary part of worship is to glorify God, and in a lot of ways wage war on the principalities and powers in that worship. Let's look at verse 6. Now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to blow them. So we've got these seven angels are going to blow seven trumpets. Now what's up with trumpets? What does that mean, trumpets being blown? Well, later in John's gospel, we're going to see that Jerusalem is connected with Egypt. And you're going to notice with these trumpets, there's some connections with the plagues of Egypt. So the Egyptian plagues coincide with some of these trumpet plagues that come. Also, the trumpet should make you think of Jericho when the nation of Israel marches around the walls. There's silence in heaven. There's silence outside the walls of Jericho. There's 7 trumpet blasts at Jericho and 7 trumpet blasts in heaven. God's people all cry out with a loud voice, and we see the same thing in both Joshua and Revelation. But trumpets also point toward the end of the world. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 informs us that at the end of times, an archangel will shout and there'll be the sound of a trumpet. Think of when any earthly city is destroyed, like Jerusalem, for example, in Matthew 24. It's a signal to the end of the world. The end of the world is going to come because of this destruction of the city. It's kind of like a harbinger. That would be the word I'm looking for. A harbinger of the end of the world. There's another possible connection with the trumpets, and that could be connected to temple liturgy. Now, we make a mistake a lot of times is we say, oh, it's got to be one of these. The trumpets are judgment, the trumpets are worship, the trumpets are warfare. But in rich biblical imagery, they could be all three. They could be all three. And think about the church wages war by worship. So trumpets could be a call to worship / call to warfare at the same time. And it is also about judgment. Now, I'm putting a chart in your notes. I'm not going to go through this chart. But if you want to pause the video right now and look at the connection of the trumpets and the plagues, this is for your benefit to see there is actually some connection between the trumpets. It might have sounded crazy. How could these 7 trumpets be connected to the plagues on Egypt? Well, here's a chart to kind of help you work through that. And there's actually more connections. Here's just a few to kind of start with. But this will give you some idea that what John is doing is borrowing from a rich matrix of language of judgment. As it goes to Babylon and Egypt specifically, you're going to see a lot of the language used against Babylon and used against Egypt pulled into the book of Revelation, because God is going to judge some of these people that have pushed back against his purposes, have persecuted his people. Let's go to verse 7. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail, fire mixed with blood. And these were thrown up on the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now, we have to be careful not to make the mistake of looking tit for tat, like every time there's a prophecy or a trumpet or a seal or a bowl that's being poured out, a chalice, there's some real world, reference. Like you could go and say, well, this trumpet happened in AD 72. That's a big mistake if you do that, because this is symbolic language. And it's giving us a spiritual truth of God's judgment. But I'm going to violate that rule real quick, because there's a really cool connection. Here I just told you that, and I'm going to do the very thing I said don't do. But there's a cool connection, because when you look at like grass being done away, burned away, and all that laid bare, there is this case that when war happens, things like that happen. The landscape looks like a lunar landscape once war is waged. For example, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Josephus says that the Romans were so distressed in building their siege ramps and all this stuff, they stripped down all the trees in the countryside. And the countryside looked like a barren wasteland. So the suburbs of Jerusalem used to be beautiful. The outskirts of Jerusalem were beautiful and adorned with trees and gardens, and they were all cut down. And he said, if you were someone who had seen Jerusalem, say 4 or 5 years before, and you came back to visit after the destruction of Jerusalem, you would not know where you are. It looked like a foreign landscape. It looked like a desert. And so in some sense, when Jerusalem was laid siege, it looked like what Revelation 8:7 is talking about in a lot of ways. Let's look at verses 8 through 9. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now, automatically, you may be thinking, Morgan Freeman's president and an asteroid's going to hit the earth. If you've seen those disaster movies. That's not what this is talking about. I mean, it sounds good. When you see this, you're thinking, yeah, this is an asteroid. It's a burning great mountain coming from space. It hits the oceans, and it's burning up. And so the sea itself is poisoned by the asteroid. And All these creatures die, all these ships are destroyed, tsunamis happen, cities are taken out. This has to be the rapture, end of the world kind of stuff. Problem with that is that that's not how these biblical images are used. So let's speak Bible judgment language real quick and go back and look at where this could be connected. Jerusalem is connected with being a city on the mountains. The seas represent the Gentile nations. And Daniel 7 tells us the four great beasts of these world kingdoms come out of the sea. So a mountain being thrown into the sea could represent Jerusalem being swallowed up by the nations. Now, you may think, okay, that's a bridge too far. The asteroid has to be the answer. This giant meteor hitting the earth and hitting the ocean, this has to be the answer. That you're going too symbolic on us. But if you go back to Jeremiah 51, when Jeremiah talks about Babylon falling, he uses the same language. He talks about a burnout mountain, and he says the sea has come over Babylon. It's been engulfed in these tumultuous waters, and we know Babylon was not covered with water from the sea. It's metaphorical. Just as I think this could be the destruction of Jerusalem being overcome by the nations, by these pagan horde armies of Rome. Let's go to verses 10 through 13. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so the third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow." Now, this idea of stars falling is connected to the fall of other empires. Babylon and its fall is referred to as the day star that falls, the son of dawn. Wormwood also has judgment overtones and connotations. It was frequently used against Israel and its judgments against Israel. And bitter water would make us think of Egypt. And so this fallen star being connected to Babylon and the bitter water being connected to Egypt. So you have these two images of judgment coming together in this symbol. So there's a reckoning coming. There's three woes coming, and it's going to be bad according to this angelic messenger, according to this eagle that's flying. Jesus issues 7 woes against the Pharisees in his covenant warnings of Matthew 23. So the fall of celestial bodies usually were connected with the fall of cities and great nations. It doesn't mean the end of the space-time continuum. It doesn't mean the end of the universe. Isaiah 13, Isaiah 24, Isaiah 34, Ezekiel 32. There are more. I didn't put them all up here. But those reference some type of celestial event being connected to the fall of a city or to a nation. Think darkening too would make us think of the plague of darkness in Egypt. And this eagle in Revelation brings a message of both judgment and salvation. You're going to see this eagle come back. And this eagle could actually be connected to the angelic cherubim, these winged creatures. So I'm hoping we are kind of breaking the code on this book, that you're learning how to read Revelation, that you're kind of picking up on this symbolic language. And I hope Revelation 8 makes a lot more sense. I hate that it's not as sensational as you might want it to be. I'm sorry that I don't agree with some that this is an asteroid or something that's going to hit the earth. I don't think that's what the book is saying. But the book is telling us that God's judgment comes against those nations who will persecute his people. God will get the final say. Vengeance is not a bad quality per se. We're just told we can't take vengeance. God can, and God will one day. God will avenge his people. And we're seeing that up close and personal in the book of Revelation. Well, thank you for watching this class, and I hope you come back for chapter 9 as we see these 3 woes that are coming, and things are going to get interesting. God bless.